and who's been very involved in addressing the Uyghur issue, including there was a major conference, what was it, GW yesterday?
Just yesterday.
Yeah, just yesterday. So, you know, I'm glad that you all could come, and we're hoping for a productive situation. And if any of you want to do any follow-up to this meeting in any way, feel free to get in touch with one or both of us. Okay.
Great, thank you. Thank you for coming out on a cold day for what's really a very grim subject, but of course an important one, and one that I think it's really vital to get more information out to you and to your friends and colleagues elsewhere. So I've been doing quite a lot of these talks, as have many of my colleagues who work on Xinjiang or the Uyghurs or ethnic issues in China. In general, as John just mentioned, there was a big symposium yesterday, with a press conference just the day before. They got some publicity, and these things have been going on in Europe and in Australia and in Japan and many other places. What we have really, you can see this grim photo, is a situation, people being put in concentration camps for re-education. In particular, members of the Uyghur ethnic group in China, but other Turkic Muslims in China as well. Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, perhaps some Hui or Chinese Muslims, and even the issue of Xinjiang and Islam in China in general has become so dangerous, so toxic, that even Han Chinese scholars and others who kind of venture into that have been getting in trouble as well. So I'm going to give you a lot of information about it, some interpretation, and then we'll have some time for questions. So this situation that we're in right now, with up to 1 million people, mainly Muslims or people from a Muslim minority group in China, locked up in camps. How did this begin? Where does it begin? This is one of the things I'm going to talk about. The approximate origins of it we can find in a campaign launched in 2014 called the Strike Hard Campaign Against Violent Terrorism. That was one of a succession of Strike Hard campaigns that have really been going on for decades in China. They're constantly announcing these campaigns to crack down, as they say, on extremism and terrorism. This time, though, was a little bit different. This, for those of you who don't know, is the Xinjiang Uyghur region, Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. There should be a Uyghur in this name. It's interesting, I didn't even notice this, but it's gotten dropped out of the name on this map, which apparently comes from Australia. Who knows? Anyway, in 2015, a new national security law targeting anti-extremism, as they called it, was promulgated in China as well, with many items that are also relevant to sort of what's going on now. In terms of criminal arrests, we've seen a boom in just the last year. You can see it's gone up by a couple 100,000 in Xinjiang alone, which accounts for the entire increase in arrests in China overall. Now this is 21% of the arrests in China in 2017 took place in Xinjiang, although the population of Xinjiang is only 1.5% of China's total. So a huge spike of people going into the criminal system. Besides that, there's a system of detention centers, which are not logged in these statistics here. And really, this is only the start. Because the main subject of what I'm talking about today are is what I'm calling the re-education gulag. A map, or a network of camps housing between 800,000 and 1 million people all around the region of Xinjiang. And these have really, they've been around since around 2015. There have been these so-called, these camps which go by various names. I'll talk about some of the names in a minute. But they really blossomed, started expanding in 2017, both in the size of individual camps and in the number of facilities that are around. They go by such names as educational transformational training centers, 教育转化培训中心. The Chinese authorities denied their existence entirely for several months after they first started being reported in Western media. And then after that, but those denials took place even after Chinese sources themselves, internal media in China, had been trumpeting their existence. So you can see this photo here. It's from the, if you look at the bottom right corner, the Xinjiang Legal Administration, Justice Administration. So this was part of internal media, internal propaganda, saying to a domestic audience, look how we're cracking down on these dangerous Uyghur people, right, in the Northwest. But when Western news started coming out, they denied their existence. Then there was a brief story that said, well, some 400,000 people have been relocated for jobs, new jobs elsewhere. They floated that for a day, and then that story had been dropped. And finally, after being called out in the UN, they admitted to having a network of these facilities, but the line that is crystallized is that they're vocational training centers where people are being taught a job, they're learning Chinese, and so on. But even in this official propaganda, it's clear that there's a point to this training. And you know, when they line people up and force them to give you know, sort of positive comments about it, that is, people who are inside these so-called schools, what they say makes very clear that the idea of these schools or camps is to reform thinking, to refashion their identity, to make them more Chinese. And this comes out even in the propaganda statements that we see. Okay, so as I said, the number of these camps has been expanding. One of the ways we know about it, and I can go into the evidence about this in great detail if we want to, but one of the ways we know about this is by the publicly announced budgets. And the spending on security in Xinjiang went up by 200% last year, some 20 billion yuan, or $2 billion, something like that. So let's look at some of the pictures of the camps here. One of the ways we know about this is actually through the work of independent scholars. There's one guy, a legal student up in Canada named Sean Zhang, who kind of made a hobby out of tracing these things, first on Google Earth, and then other open source satellite imagery companies have gotten involved in sort of comparing images over time. And when you do this, you can see the sorts of changes that happen. So here, a school, a soccer field has been given over to these sort of Quonset hut type housing structures. Dabancheng, which is a little bit outside of Urumqi, right out in the desert, you can see the changes there and the building of this large facility there. This has been analyzed quite closely by architects working with the BBC. We're just going to give a little shout out to Sean because he's really done amazing work here. You can follow him on Twitter, and he's sort of put together this. Okay, so these are just some pictures of some of the camps, of what they look like. Again, these are taken by various people, journalists. Walk right up to them. The architectural features: these guard towers, high walls, razor wire, multiple fences, the ubiquitous convenience police stations along the sides. We'll see some more of those later. Are all really part of the template of these camps. So this is what we were just looking at from the satellite view. Camp in Turpan, which the Wall Street Journal went to. And you can see that it's actually expanded. This is, again, that corner. You can see that it goes back, or one of these corners, with multiple housing units. Here's one in Hotan, or Yitan. And then here, again, from the satellite photo, you can see here's the re-education center. Itself somewhat secured, there's barbed wire and so on around it. But then just down the road is a much bigger camp. And then again, looking at this site over time, here's the camp we were just looking at. So let's see, if you spot on right, these two buildings here, there they are there, you see that it's been built out even further to the back with even more of these compounds being planned. And again, here they built a wall. You can see the guard tower and the wall. They haven't filled it in yet on this side. Even the smaller camps and even ones that appear in Chinese media like this, here we have some cotters, they look like visiting. Again, highly secured barbed wire, inconsistent with what you would find around a school, vocational school. Now this is quite interesting. This scholar, go with this one here. He was visiting the this city of Karakash, or Moyu, and traveling through. And he took pictures of this gateway. You can see these are two sides of the gate. He was taking pictures of the poster, which talks about Xi Jinping, his heart connected to the local people in a the kind of picture Mao Zedong used to like to have himself portrayed as well. But what the Runa who traveled there, what he didn't notice at the time was what exactly this compound was. And going back later, he noticed it. And so this is, as you can see, Moyu Xian Jizhong Jiaoyu Zhuanhua Peishun Zhongxin. It even has the word Jizhong, concentration, in the name. Right? And this was a couple of years ago, so this is one of the ones. Some of these camps were kind of retrofitted schools or hospitals or those kinds of existing centers that were turned into the camps. The big new ones, though, if we look down here, here's the label on this one, also in the Khotan general area. It too has that name, Jizhong. Now, the official sources from the PRC don't discuss the number of people in the camps, the length of time that they stay there, how people are selected to be interned. We know very few people who have come out of the camps after being interned since 2017. There are a few people who've come out, which gives us some information. But for the most part, for example, what we find out from Uyghurs abroad about who've lost relatives into the camps, for the most part, people haven't come out again. So it's been upwards of many, many months or over a year for most people that we know about. The chairman of, that is the head of the government of Xinjiang region, Shofat Zakir, has been talking about what students are supposed to be learning in these camps. And again, this is the official story. And so as we see, they want to learn Chinese, they're getting scientific knowledge, they're enhancing their understanding of history, culture, national conditions, textbooks. They're going to learn about the law, the Constitution, and then at least one vocational skill, perhaps clothing and footwear making, food processing, electronics, typesetting, e-commerce, hairdressing. I don't think these gentlemen here are good for hairdressing or e-commerce, perhaps. But in any case, this is a rather large curriculum to expect people to make. One of the most distressing things about this is that when adults get put away into the camps, their children are becoming wards of the state. Sometimes they stay with grandparents, but there's stories of them ultimately being taken away from grandparents as well. There are distressing numbers of cases where one parent is outside China, the other is inside, and that person is put away. Sometimes the parent, there's many cases from Pakistan, where Pakistanis have Uyghur wives, children in China, and the Pakistani businesses going back and forth. Their wives are put in camps, their children disappear. Nobody knows where they are. So there are some orphanages. There was some business tenders looking for people who can work in these orphanages or to build these kinds of facilities for children. But a lot of the concern is about what's going on with kids, and of course this fear that they're going to be raised as Chinese, taught only Chinese. All right, now, what do we know about what happens inside these camps? From the few people who've come out, we know that there are actually a range of them. And so some of the Chinese propaganda that talks about them, that talks about vocational schools and shows people learning how to sew or do other kinds of trades, they may actually be filmed in real vocational facilities like that. But there are others that are much, much closer to prisons, and really quite grim prisons. From what we know, housing is very crowded, 8 to 12 or more to a room. People sleep and sit on benches around the sides of the room. There's a single bucket for a toilet in the middle. People engage in forced calisthenics, starting with early morning runs. They sing propaganda songs praising Xi Jinping. They watch films. There's some evidence of working in factories on site from some of these camps. We can see that there are factories or industrial facilities as part of that. Apparently, Chinese language education is part of it as well, but we don't know exactly what form that takes, particularly with these older inmates, and many of them are older. There was one report from northern Xinjiang by a Kazakh that they were being taught Chinese using the Sanzijian, the three-character classic. And this is an ancient Confucian classic. It was very popular for teaching little boys in the 19th century, but it's for rote learning, memorization. It's a rhythmical text like that. It's not a good way to learn Chinese, but very steeped in Confucian values, Confucian ideas. There's a lot of criticism of their culture, in the sense that Uyghur or Kazakh culture is backward, that Islam is backward, forced self-criticisms to echo these points. All of this harkens back to Maoist kinds of approaches. There are stories that people are forced or given pork to consume. People who don't display the right attitude are subjected to more physical kinds of abuse. These include constraint positions, being forced to stand at a wall, being locked into an iron chair known as a tiger chair, deprivation of food, deprivation of sleep, solitary confinement. And there are reports from people who've come out of suicides or attempted suicides. Certainly many people subjected to this kind of psychological torture have suicidal feelings. And it's worth noting, too, that just in terms of thinking about the long-term effects of this policy, when you put hundreds of thousands of people, incarcerate hundreds of thousands of people for long periods of time, just statistically, people are going to die, right? Particularly there are a lot of elderly in there. You're going to have a number of people who die like this. And there are cases of elderly relatives and others who have passed away in these camps. Their family members aren't given access to the bodies. No one knows exactly what's going on. So this will leave a legacy of common belief, even if it's not true, that abuse is responsible for the death of many people's relatives. Now, besides these kind of first-person accounts, really kind of the strongest body of evidence that we have is from Uyghurs abroad, all over the world. And virtually everyone whom you talk to has at least one relative who's disappeared into these camps. And the way you know this is because, first of all, they cut off all contact through WeChat, so this messaging app, which is very popular in China, or other ways. Sometimes, if they contact through a third party, a relative, a distant friend, they will very, very carefully write back, so-and-so has gone to school, or so-and-so got malaria and had to go to the hospital, using these kind of euphemisms. Because, of course, all communications like this can be monitored and increasingly are monitored by security forces. In terms of the numbers, the way we come up with these numbers of sort of 800,000 to 1 million, and part of it is looking at the capacity of the camps that have been built, and part of it is from reports from local officials who Radio Free Asia or other journalists actually just sort of call up and ask, how many people have you put away? And you find out sort of county levels how many people are put away. You calculate what percentage of the Uyghur population in those areas that is. And this has been extrapolated by sort of all the areas and other sort of population data like that. And then there's a document that came out. We don't really know the provenance. It looks pretty realistic. That actually lists for a whole bunch of counties, not the main cities, but everything else. It lists the numbers very precisely of people who were put away by a certain period. It was back in 2017. And again, in terms of orders of magnitude and scale, that lines up with the estimates that we come up with through these other sorts of methods. So there's various ways in which we're coming to this information about what's going on and how many people are affected by it. It's not just a guess. Now, according to official statements, these centers are for people who've committed minor crimes. And they're being taught a trade to help them avoid extremism. Now, there's many reasons why we know that that is not true. Part of it is that many doctors, professors, all the Uyghur elites seem to be among the first people who have been put into the camps, which is not to say they're not capable of committing crimes, but they certainly don't need vocational education and seamsmanship, that kind of thing like that. But the ideology, again, in official statements themselves, these sort of rationale and the metaphors that are used for what's going on here are really very telling. Here you see, I'll read some of it. If we do not eradicate religious extremism at its roots, violent terrorist incidents will grow and spread all over like an incurable malignant tumor. Excuse me. So this is preventive, right? Is the idea. It's not meant to be punishing people. It's meant to prevent crimes from happening. As we see, a certain number of people who've been indoctrinated with extremist ideology have not committed any crime. They're infected by the disease. There's always a risk that illness will manifest itself at any moment, so they must have the virus cleansed, and so on. Other statements, again, in official sources, use the metaphor of weed killer, chemotherapy, right, these sort of things. And what's interesting about that is, in both cases, it's the entire body or the entire field, good crops as well as weeds, that need to be treated in order for this kind of a approach to work. So that's clearly the thinking that's behind it. It's meant to be collective, innocent people as well as everyone else, in order to wipe out what is seen as extremism. What makes this worse is that the notion of extremism itself, this is really a catchword that has, particularly since 2001, when China sort of latched on to the global war on terror, as a way of branding its separatist problem in Xinjiang. The idea of extremism is central to this concern about the Uyghurs and other Muslims in Xinjiang. But the definition of what comprises extremist thought, action, behavior, writings, and so on, has been expanding wildly. Because it's not clearly defined, and there's, as I see it, competition, or at least incentives at the level of local officials to fulfill the mandates coming down from the top through the most aggressive and broad attack on extremism possible. There was also a document released a couple of years ago listing 75 manifestations of extremism. And I'll tell you what some of those manifestations are in a minute. Police picked these up in various ways. By scanning cell phones, for example, whatever kind of documents or communication are on there. But there's another way, and that is through home visits by usually Han Chinese Communist Party members. Some 1 million of them, it's been announced, have been sent to live in houses, in the homes with Uyghur families in southern Xinjiang mainly, for up to a week. And then they visit again periodically. And this is a broad campaign called Becoming Relatives, becoming jiaqin, becoming kin. But the manuals that these party officials have been given before they go, well, the propaganda about it all is lots of friendly scenes, and they help out around the house, and lots of eating together, and singing songs, and teaching people to read. They're very paternalistic. They refer to the Uyghurs as younger sisters and younger brothers, with that kind of phraseology. But the manuals that these visitors are instructed with tell them to keep an eye out for all of this kind of extremism. Watch out, what is hung on the walls? Do they watch state TV, or do they seem to have a lot of mysterious DVDs or videos lying around? And they're instructed in particular to talk to the children, because children do not lie. They will let you know what's really going on. So anyway, some of the things that they look for, and that police are looking out for, that are seen as signs of extremism, are whether people use the greeting Assalamu alaikum, that's extremist. Veils, head coverings, hijab, abnormal beards on men, meaning anything big, any kind of beard on a young man is seen as abnormal and dangerous. Clothing that is too long on women, the hem length too long, is seen as extremist. Praying too much or in the wrong place is suspicious. or having relatives who do this. There's been, for several years now, rules against certain Islamic baby names. And I don't know if you can see some of them here. I don't know, it's not very clear, but if you can, some of you here can probably read the Uyghur script. It's a version of Arabic. But here, let's see, so Talib is one. This one, what is this? Sorry, I can't read that. Muhaiti? A fighter for, a struggler for Islam. Oh, right, yeah. Mujahid, right? So, but Muhammad, Maria, Fatima, even those names are also, forbidden. What other things? So the star and crescent symbol. You can see here any kind of Islamic symbolism like this. I think I've seen Professor Jonathan Brown wearing a T-shirt like this one time. Watch out when he wears that. Mosque attendance. Many of the neighborhood mosques, smaller mosques are now closed across Xinjiang. The larger ones are open with all sorts of metal detectors and scanners and so on. But people are afraid to go because you have to register your identity before you go in. And that could get you thrown into the camps. Even references to the moon in names, so the Turkic word I, it's very, very common, Aynur, those kind of things. That could be problematic. Weddings that are too simple, sign of extremism. Maybe don't use music, or too religious. There was a woman who was put into camp for cleansing a corpse before a funeral, so Islamic style funerals. And there's a big push across China now for universal cremation of bodies. And one of the most chilling things, I'm hoping we misinterpret this, one of the most chilling pieces of news was, again, government bids for workers at new crematoria to be built across Xinjiang. And there's again, the feeling is that this is a push to change funereal practices, not to hide corpses. But it's just scary nonetheless. Quran, reading the Quran, the wrong kind of books on one's shelves, visiting Sufi shrines, which is of course part of traditional Uyghur practice, praying with feet too far apart or hands too high up on the chest, refusing to eat non-halal brands, refusing to consume state TV or radio, or appearing not to do it. Not smoking is a sign of extremism. Not drinking is a sign of extremism. Any kind of connection with foreigners, relatives abroad, people who studied abroad, desire to go abroad, having traveled yourself, in particular to 26 sensitive countries, but also to the United States, Australia, Europe, Western countries, obviously, which are seen as critical by China, and so on and so forth. There are many of these kinds of things. And the list is so broad and diffuse that it, of course, functions as a way of terrifying people. You don't quite know what sort of behavior could get you in trouble thrown into the camps. Fasting in Ramadan, for example, is another one of those things. So it has the effect of really trying to secularize the society. Now, even outside these camps, and even for a few more years, this sort of campaign against Islam, it really is a campaign against Islamic practice, has been going on for some time. And we see, recently, as I mentioned, mosques are being closed. Here you see this shuttered mosque has a big sign. It says, "Love the party, love the country." It has a Chinese flag on the top. The crescent moons have been taken off of the top of mosques all over the region. But this is interesting because there used to be a slogan that you would see very often in Islamic settings and even on mosques. It wasn't "ai dang, ai guo," it was "ai guo, ai jiao." So love the country, love the religion. So the religions have been dropped out of the equation, and the party has been substituted into this slogan and these new phrases. Here, the Testament of Faith is removed, you can see, from the gate of this mosque in Urumqi. This is the big one in the central of Urumqi, the Arda Chao. The moon is still there, I guess, on the roof of the main dome. And then this has been going on really for over a decade, but you know, the old city of Kashgar was essentially condemned on the grounds that it was unsafe in earthquakes, which may have been somewhat the case, but it has, of course, survived for centuries. And as a way of ameliorating that, it was decided that much of it needed to be torn down, and that people, and this is actually, so in some places it looks rather chaotic like this, but some of the parts of the older, really central city was really very beautiful, very quiet, clean, and well constructed, but not, of course, easily penetrable by the state, not legible in James Scott's sense, right? So there was a great concern about that. So much of this has been torn down in recent years. People have been moved out to new skyscraper developments outside of the city, you know, projects essentially in the outskirts. And this has been going on for years. A real blow to Uyghur culture in that Kashgar is really the heart of particularly southern Xinjiang, but in the sense of this old city is the heart of Uyghur culture. And then the old city has been replaced by a kind of Disneyfied version, simulacrum of itself, shown here, of course, with more dancers. There's an ongoing campaign against other kinds of Islamic symbols. It spreads to Hui and other Muslims in China as well. Here you see in this sign that the Haji has been removed there. And then in Chinese, this man's name is Bak Haji. So Baka, they leave the A in Chinese, so Baka A, Uyghur traditional medicine. But there, again, it's and down here in English even too, they call it. Just take the G away. Hui, those of you who know China probably know that the Chinese Muslims are famous for niu mian, for their cold beef noodles. But this Huizhou niu mian shop, they decided it was better not to be Huizhou anymore, and they substituted it with words that mean one family, echoing one family ideology that's very Confucian. It's also a big part of Xi Jinping's arguments and his ideology these days. The campaign against halal here being framed in a quite widely circulated editorial, being framed as halal eating is not scientific, it's not modern. At the molecular level, pork and lamb are all the same, so why not eat both? Right? That's kind of the argument. Similarly, there's been a big push now to kind of redefine the history of the Uyghurs and relative to a conception of generic and general Chinese identity. And that's a term which in Chinese is, it's not the word Han, although it has all the characteristics of Han. It's Zhonghua. And this is kind of this new generic term which is becoming more and more important in ethnic discourse in China today. The argument here, you see, is that Uyghurs are not descended from the Turks, and some have even gone as far as to say the Uyghur language actually derives from Chinese as well. But that Zhonghua is the source of all ethnic diversity in China. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So besides the camps and all these other phenomena that I've been talking about, there's been quite widely reported securitization of the entire region. Some people say that really life in Xinjiang is like living in a camp itself. And this began really with the arrival in Xinjiang of a new First Party Secretary, Chen Quanguo, who came from Tibet, where he was responsible for rolling out a system of grid policing there that was quite effective in dampening down unrest. They had big riots in Tibet in 2008. He was seen as a real troubleshooter who did a good job. So they transferred him into Xinjiang, where he started rolling out a similar kind of grid policing system. And here, just quickly, I'll run through. You can see these convenience police stations in various places. So here, tucked into Old Kashgar as well. The scholar Aaron Byler did a little study of these convenience police stations around Xinjiang University, which is mainly Uyghur students study there. Around the university in Urumqi, just mapped them out with Google Earth. And you can see how they really kind of enclose the campus with this network of police stations. So besides, within this network, of course, there are constant patrols. There are police marching around, often driving around in cop cars with the sirens going, constantly as a reminder of their presence. And there's the famous high-tech aspect of this. This includes all sorts of things. In particular, facial recognition cameras, which are quite famous now for all over China. These are linked to ID cards and to your photo that's in the system, and they can track people very, very well. I'll show you. There's a video, you can look this up online if you're interested. They can track vehicles and people as they move around the city in real time, and it keeps a record of all the various places where people have been. There's face scanning technology on phones. The police can scan your face, check to make sure that you are who they say you are, keep a record of that. Let's see. Other biometric information that's been gathered very intensively includes iris data, so iris scans, fingerprint, blood type, voice print, gait scanning of how you walk. We've been scanning people with 360 views of this. And then through a series of free checkups, which were mandatory for everyone over the past year or so, DNA has been gathered. And all of this information is put together in one's individual file and linked to your ID card and, of course, to your face. So there's a huge database now on all of the people in Xinjiang. And to some extent, this is expanding to other parts of China as well. But there's also been a behavioral survey that people have been forced to take because it's administered through your housing or your school, or sometimes children are forced to make their parents do it. And this codes all sorts of aspects of private life of yourself and your relatives, including religious practices, your ethnicity itself. You lose points based on, if you're a Uyghur, that kind of lowers you a little bit from the baseline. Prayer, again, foreign contacts, all those kinds of information you can see go into the coding, the scoring of this, and of course the numbers are crunched. And that number which results from this gets you ranked as safe, unsafe, safe, normal, or unsafe. And that in turn determines your access to loans, it determines your access to buying travel tickets, where you can go. Certain parts of the city will be off limits to you, and other sorts of things like this. And I mentioned, of course, already that the cell phone is really the key pivot point to all of this. There's a nanny app which people are forced to put on their phones. It keeps track of everything that's on it. They've now developed scanning technology that creates quick transcriptions of voice and of Uyghur language transcriptions, and so they can go through and see, they can gather even what's being said in voice conversations like this. And of course, any kind of foreign calls or texts coming in, they ping something in the AI system so that people know about this. All right. So let me, in the interest of time, I'm going to get on to just some of my interpretations for this and kind of the background for some of this. Why is this happening? Why is this happening now? How does it fit in with what's admittedly a history of certainly not of mistreatment of minority groups in China in general, particularly Uyghurs and Tibetans? How does that fit into that broader pattern? First of all, without giving too long of a history lesson, I just want to highlight that when this region came under Beijing's control for the first time in the 18th century, this was under the Qing Empire. And the Qing Empire generally, as many empires do, ruled through a sort of pluralistic system. This is not democratic pluralism at all, it's very top-down. But they knew that it wasn't a useful tactic, it wasn't useful practice to try to interfere on the ground level with people's culture too much. And they tended to put, well, they didn't tend to. In Xinjiang, they very explicitly put Uyghurs under the control of Uyghur officials, Mongol groups under Mongol officials, Han under Han officials, and so on. Used this kind of ethnically segregated system, an administrative legal pluralism to more or less keep people happy while they sort of control things from a higher level. And again, one could sort of debate the overall success of this. It was an empire after all. It was a imposed rule. But as empires go and as imperial territories tend to fare, Xinjiang did pretty well under the Qing. From the historian's point of view, from some distance, you can see that populations increased broadly. The economy did very well. There was expansion of arable land and other sorts of measures like that. So, again, it was a successful imperial venture for the Qing. The Qing dynasty fell in the early 20th century. For a few decades, there were a combination of former Qing officials, Han Chinese governors, warlords ruling in the region. And very broadly, you could say that those rulers who continued this kind of pluralistic approach, maintained the balance between different ethnic groups, did pretty well. They ruled for 10, 15 years sometimes. Those who didn't, it all blew up in their face very, very quickly. We tried to impose Chinese ways on that. So that was the background. The PRC took over the region in 1949, but already since 1937, a system that resembled the Soviet system of multiple nationalities had already been implemented in Xinjiang. So there was recognition of Kazakhs and Kyrgyz and Uyghur and Chinese and Manchu and Mongol. Different groups were recognized by the state in Xinjiang, and certain resources were allocated to them on the basis of their ethnicity. And that is, in a kind of microcosm, the kind of system that the PRC applied to its minorities around China over the next decades. This word for nationality or ethnicity in Chinese is minzu, and so scholars for shorthand refer to this as the minzu system. And in broad strokes, it's similar to what's sometimes called, the empire of nations in the Soviet Union, or the affirmative action empires and other things termed right in those things. So in broad terms, it looked like that. And again, broadly speaking, it was popular and arguably successful, given how difficult it is to take a former empire and turn it into something like a nation state, while at the same time maintaining the facade that you are a Leninist party opposed to imperialism. Right? It's difficult to take over an empire if you're anti-imperialist. So how do you do that? So the difference between the Soviet approach and the Chinese approach, in ideological terms, is subtle but important. The Soviet Union was not called Russia. But of course, China was not going to run away from the Chinese tradition in forming new China. Right? And so there's always been this tension between what is the broad identity of China as a state today versus the identity of one of those 56 minorities, the Han people, right? And how do non-Han peoples fit into a modern Chinese state? And so there's various ways to deal with this. As I said, the kind of top-down multicultural or top-down pluralism of the Minzu system was the way that China struck upon to do this. Broadly popular among the minorities. And in anthropological terms, the explanation for this was articulated most famously by an anthropologist known as Fei Xiaotong. And his work was published in 1989 with some fanfare. And he argued that the 56 minorities, or 56 ethnic groups of China, each have their own existence, their own integrity. But that the Zhonghua, the Chinese ethnicity, the Chinese identity, rests on top as kind of a crystallization or a culmination. And of course, he's saying you can have multiple identities at once. There's higher level and lower level ones. All of that is more or less in keeping with, I think, what anthropologists everywhere would accept. Fei Xiaotong was obviously essentializing the idea of Minzu, the idea of ethnicity, into making it ahistorical, because they trace those all the way back through time. But nonetheless, this idea that there can be a broader national identity on top of this individual identity was the system that they had. Now, after 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart, there was great concern in China, among policymakers in particular, that the reason the Soviet Union fell apart was precisely because of its ethno-national system, right? That it had maintained these divisions as fault lines rather than blurring them and just making them disappear. Now, that's not how most scholars in the West would interpret the fall of the Soviet Union. It was obviously a very complex event. But that was one main theme that Chinese thinkers and policymakers saw as a problem, and it worried them greatly because they thought this could be a ticking time bomb for China as well. And so around about 2005, a policy debate began in the journals of ethnicity studies journals and in party journals over this Minzu system. Should there be a second generation Minzu system? Should this system be depoliticized so that the sort of titular autonomous regions, autonomous provinces, and autonomous counties shouldn't have the name of a particular Minzu on them? So various kinds of things were proposed along those lines. And one of the arguments that was put forward was to bring in a melting pot based on a belief that the melting pot was an accurate representation of how ethnicity was dealt with in the West, and particularly in America. To replace an hors d'oeuvres style with a melting pot was one argument. This debate was quite divisive because the Minzu system is deeply entrenched in the very structures of government, all the way from the bottom to the top. And of course, the non-Han ethnic groups themselves have a lot of stake in this system. In 2014, Chinese President Xi Jinping convened a Central Ethnic Work Conference where some of these things were talked about. He delivered a speech which was, after he delivered it, was much debated, and there was some things in it that both sides of the debate could use. But in retrospect, looking back on it, we can see that he was really signaling a shift. Not necessarily an abandonment of the first generation for a new generation, but certainly a shift in how ethnicity should be interpreted and ethnic groups should be dealt with. One thing he did was to say that in addition to material concerns, spiritual concerns were also important. So 精神上的问题, right? Now that was a signal that raising standards of living for restive groups would not necessarily be enough. And this is something that people had recognized. Tibet's standard of living, Xinjiang's standard of living was higher than it had been. Nonetheless, these issues still continued. So beside that, you needed to work on spiritual conditions. Cultural identity, he stressed, was very important. And he rolled out an idea of that Minzu, non-Han Minzu, must adhere to the 4 identifications. Okay, so identification with the motherland, identification with the Chinese nation, with Chinese culture, and with the socialist road with Chinese characteristics. So in other words, economic development itself was going to be no panacea for resolving what we're seeing as very serious ethnic problems. And new words came into the discussion, into the discourse. Mingling, for example, jiaorong is being talked about as more important. The ethnicities needed to mingle more, even fusion. And Xi Jinping argued in his speeches that Chinese history was itself a continual process of inter-ethnic mingling and fusion directed towards achieving all under heaven great harmony, tianxia datong. So again, drawing on this kind of Confucianist language that he's very fond of, making the point that the way in which harmony, all under heaven, and of course national greatness and the China dream would be achieved would be by mingling together, erasing the differences between the Minzu, which the old system had in fact precisely maintained and celebrated. Now just 2 or 3 days ago, the Chinese State Council released a white paper about the situation in Xinjiang. And it's a response to a lot of the criticism that they've been getting. lately. And a lot of it talks about what's going on right now in the region. But there's a historical preamble, which I found quite interesting, because it stresses that the Zhonghua Minzu, so the Chinese identity, Chinese ethnicity, is the root, is the source. The Chinese civilization is the source of other Minzu culture, all of which arise out of that. And it says this in several different ways, and then even uses historical examples. What has happened then is that that old kind of inverted, let's see, that old pyramid that Fei Xiaotong had talked about, with the Zhonghua identity on top of all the 56, that's now been flipped on its head. And Chinese civilization is seen as the root from which the other Minzu have developed out of, diversified out of. But they need to be pulled back in together again. All right, so what I'm arguing here, and I think, obviously there are various reasons for this. There's concern about political violence and unrest on the ground, and I can talk about some of those incidents if you want to in the question and answer in a minute. But I think the ideological background to what's going on now is precisely this shift towards an assimilationist approach to cultural difference, away from what really was a multicultural approach with Chinese characteristics that China has maintained, not just since 1949, but which really has roots in imperial China as well. A kind of pragmatic multiculturalism is really part of the Chinese tradition. And that, of course, is a great irony, because the way I see it, what's happening right now is that in chasing after a kind of homogeneous national population and trying to kind of create one through brute force, China is actually turning its back on its own particular multicultural traditions, precisely at a moment when those multicultural traditions would be interesting, at least, and perhaps useful for the world at large to see, right? Given that we have so much problems with diversity, and every society is debating these and struggling with how to deal with them. China has its own history to put forward of how it dealt with them, and you can see that. In fact, in one realm of policy, China is actually trumpeting its own kind of multiculturalism. Many of you will be familiar with this kind of image. It's from the Cultural Revolution, but it's been perpetuated ever since. The happy, smiling, usually dancing nationalities in their national garb, arrayed, representing China. And this has been a very, very strong, continuous way China has represented itself. You can see this at the Beijing Olympics in particular, right? And we sort of laughed at it because a lot of the kids dressed up like this were actually local Han kids from elite Beijing schools. They weren't really nationalities. But nonetheless, this is really has been the China brand. All right, the realm in which we're seeing this kind of Minzuized representation being perpetuated now is in the rhetoric and propaganda about China's Belt and Road. And I just want to end with a little clip about that. This is a recent propaganda video that's come out about, you all know the Belt and Road Initiative, China's grand developmental scheme for Eurasia and actually Latin America and other places that are included in it as well. So this came out a couple of weeks ago, I think. It may be excruciating to some, but I'm going to let it play almost 2 minutes, so bear with me. And some of you will recognize the tune now. should say this is people's daily video, so it's organ of the state. This kind of headgear, of course, is illegal in Xinjiang now and can be thrown into a camp. There, that's where I wanted to end. Okay. With that, I'll take any of your questions. Yes?
Is there any evidence that they're exporting the security model to Southeast Asian countries that have ethnic minority groups? Singapore?
So the technology has been exported to Latin America. Some of the AI and the scanning and so on. And I think actually to maybe Ethiopia has some contracts where they're looking at it. As far if you want to take everything that I'm talking about as one model, no, not as an entire package, but the security and the tech. And that's actually one of the reasons we know about it, so much about it, because it's with a certain amount of glee that the companies that produce this, and mostly they're Chinese companies, talk about it, and they produce their promotional videos and so on, so look what we can do. And this is very interesting to a lot of states, governments, and others.
Yeah, I was involved in the last decade somewhat in Chinese affairs and religious affairs in particular. And it looked kind of promising. They were very worried after 9/11, as we were too. And they wanted a lot of conversation about that. And it seemed to me that they were kind of going on more. And then the first time I was sort of out of the picture in 2008 with the Olympics, there seemed to be a real wave of paranoia. And I've just been in Kazakhstan, where there's kind of, they're kind of self-hating Muslims in a way. They're also paranoid, I think, about some of the same things. I think a lot of, but my theory is a lot of it is internet driven and paranoia about the contagion of extremist ideas. I just want to hear your reaction to that.
So the argument right now for why Uyghurs are dangerous in China is that they've been infected with ideas that come in mainly via the internet, but through other means like this. And they're vulnerable minds that are infected by this. And that, of course, there has been influence from some of these quarters. I'm talking about the kinds of political violence and other violence that's happened. I draw certain distinctions because I think if you're trying to figure out the causes, you need to distinguish what they are. From 1997, there some incidents earlier on than that, but looking more recently, from 1997 through 2008, there was really nothing that happened, at least that we know about. No large-scale demonstrations, no riots, no terrorist acts. But throughout that time, and particularly after 2001, there was this drumbeat in China, and also outside of China, and the Western media, and particularly kind of the think tank world, the anti-terrorism industrial complex, has a lot to answer for that. And so talking about it, and it didn't really happen until after 2008, we started seeing incidents that sort of fit the template of jihadist terrorist attacks, by which I mean random attacks on civilians, but with religious coloring, perhaps, that are meant to make a point like this. I'm distinguishing that from other forms. For example, a bunch of men attack a police station, maybe with agricultural tools or knives. These shed blood as well. Things like this can happen, but it's not so clearly taken from the same kind of background or desire to make a point or whatever. So there's been all of those, and in recent years there's been some horrific terrorist attacks as well as other episodes of what we might call even small-scale rebellion or certainly unrest in the area. So China is very concerned with stability. Any official in charge of any region in China, one of your main jobs is to make sure things like this don't happen, particularly in Xinjiang. So they do have this concern with stability. But in terms of diagnosing the causes, of course, the diagnosis that they won't consider is that policies themselves are leading to more trouble. Even though if you track the crackdowns and you track the violence, they track very, very closely. There was one event that not a lot of people know about that it's worth talking about, or one thing that happened, and this was in the aftermath of 2001. A few months after that, China very, very quickly rebranded its separatist issue in Xinjiang. They had talked about it before as counter-revolutionary, as separatism, as pan-Turanianism or pan-Turkism, and pan-Islamism. But they hadn't really talked about it as Islamic extremism or terrorism, particularly. They did. The global war on terror was the opportunity. They just changed all the rhetoric around this, and they signaled that, in particular with a white paper that came out early in 2002. And there it was an interesting paper. I reviewed it, read it quite closely at the time. It gave a whole list of different groups and organizations, a real alphabet soup of different groups, and said, look at all these terrorist organizations that exist. And then it gave a list of acts that had happened, things that had gone wrong, 62 deaths, 144 injuries from terrorist acts over the previous 10 years. And for the next 5 or 7 years, they would constantly say, look at the 62 and 144 acts that happened over the past 10 years. It was kind of a moving 10-year period. It never became 11 years, it was always 10 years. But in any case, that was this document that came out. What it didn't do was ever to connect specific acts with specific groups. There's kind of a generic way of talking about East Turkestan forces. East Turkestan is a term which many Uyghurs use as their national name. There were a couple of East Turkestan republics in the past. So there's a kind of generic way of talking about that. Now, I think it was November of 2002, the United States was looking for China to sign on to a UN resolution which was recognizing that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and had violated its terms of its earlier agreements like this. This would become a resolution that the Bush administration would look to as a UN justification of the invasion of Iraq. That's controversial whether that's what it meant or not, but in any case. So we wanted China to sign on to that. In return for that, the Bush administration agreed to list a Uyghur group as a terrorist organization, as an international terrorist organization. So they looked at this list. They found this one group, ETIM, East Turkestan Islamic Movement, which was very small. And I actually talked to someone in the State Department at the time. He said, yeah, that's why we picked it, because it didn't really amount to anything. But it did seem to have, they had camps in Afghanistan. They seemed to have some kind of connection with Osama bin Laden, although these relations were strained. And subsequent stories that have come out, they seem to have had one AK-47 that they took turns practicing with and spent most of their time renovating a building. Right. So it was a very small group. In any case, that was listed. But in announcing this listing, the US government statement took the language from the Chinese white paper, and they said that all of the previous acts of the 10 years, those 64 deaths and 144 injuries, had been perpetrated by ETIM. And so the US government really created this specter of an organized terrorist movement, terrorist group, which had done all of these things over a 10-year period in Xinjiang. Right? Which, in fact, there was no such group that had done this. Maybe these things happened, but they were not done by one. And then, of course, many of you will have heard of ETIM, right? It then became the name to conjure with, and all of the think tanks were sort of chasing it down, and of course those organization charts with leaders, and so all of those got drawn up after that. And the ruler, or the head of ETIM was killed a couple of years after that. And as far as anyone can tell now, the organization disappeared. and subsequent groups have claimed to take up the mantle. But in any case, so the idea of broad, organized, powerful terrorist group of Uyghurs has been grossly exaggerated for a long time. And acts have come out that seem to fit the model, as I said, in the 2013 through 15 period. But in a way, really, those are recent, and all of this could be seen in a sense as a self-fulfilling prophecy, rather than actually the final blowing up of the powder keg, or whatever kind of metaphors tend to be used. Yes.
First, I want to say thank you for this very important and disturbing presentation. You just talked about think tanks and kind of the broader climate of the war on terror, and I wonder how this sort of industry around combating violent extremism, CVE, a lot of it based here in DC, is there any evidence that this is circulated to China, that the kinds of curriculum or programs that have emerged here in the US are now being exported to aid programs, that there's been conversations between these groups or circulation of these materials between here and China?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't really know. I'm not connected with those groups in either level. I mean, certainly there's interest, and China's been visiting think tanks and so on. They send delegations quite frequently to talk about it. There's a lot of interest on the Chinese part in collaboration with the U.S. in the war on terror, which the U.S. has been kind of lukewarm about, precisely because they know about China's human rights record and have never really seen that big of a threat with the Uyghurs. I was invited. It was quite surprising to me in 2008, before the Olympics, because everyone thought that Uyghur terrorism was going to be a huge threat, right? I was invited to a meeting here in town, and there were some of these think tank people there. There were CIA people there, which surprised me. I was there as an expert on the Uyghurs, and that surprised me too, because I'm not really, and I'm thinking, God, if they're asking me, I thought they knew the answers to these questions, right? So it was a representative of GE, who was a major sponsor from the Olympics. So they kind of talked about it, and basically it was like, nah, we're not that worried. But I was surprised to see that. I thought somebody knew the score, what's really happening, the cloak and dagger of these supposed terrorist groups, and no, so I didn't really answer your question because I don't know the answer. Like the techniques and approaches or models of talking about terrorism, you mean, or? Well,
there's this whole industry around combating violent extremism now that's targeted toward Muslims in the U.S. as well as being exported to like Jordan through U.S. aid.
Yes. So, all right, you know what? I don't know, but I'm curious about that, because if you read the Chinese statements where they're saying, all we're doing is what you've done, we're combating violent extremism through these means, but we're going to be successful, whereas you have all failed, look at all the problems, right? And so they are using that language a little bit. The techniques, I think, are different, but they have adopted some of that, Yes?
I mean, I probably had a similar question, just because I noted that a lot of the radicalization or the more extreme versions of Islam they note are very similar to Prevent and CVE models both in the US and the UK. I think that's also one of the parallels. But another question I had was like the role of WeChat. I was reading recently that some of the things that are circulated the most on WeChat have to do with Islam and terrorism, as opposed to things that actually happen in the news, like healthcare, etc. And I was wondering if there's been kind of analysis of outside groups manipulating WeChat or spreading misinformation on platforms like WeChat, kind of parallel to the way that's been done in the US.
But I don't know if maybe we read the same thing. Foreign Policy had a piece on this just the other day or something. But yeah, WeChat is full of Islamophobic kind of materials and alarmist stuff and wrong claims and all of this. China internally developed some of it too. There's a lot of kind of fear, particularly of Uyghurs. I mean, a lot of this is, well, first to answer your question. According to Foreign Policy, I think there's been a study that's done. A lot of this stuff comes from Western right-wing media, and but also the Russian fake news machine as well. It's translated into Chinese, and spread there. What's interesting there is WeChat is something that the state completely controls, if they want to, but they've chosen not to clamp down on Islamophobia at all. And they let it run rampant. And this has a real effect on people's opinions, as I was saying to John earlier. I think even if people don't believe that all of these things are vocational schools, but they think, well, yes, but these Uyghurs are violent, something needs to be done. Right? And there's an argument that a lot of what is being done, and this is why we see the propaganda, internal propaganda in China, that is not all, rainbows or unicorns peeing rainbows, that it's like grim-looking stuff. They're saying, look what we're doing, right? They want to be strong. Because the main political concern, and I would say, I don't know if this is recognized well. I don't think there's a serious, there is not a serious separatist threat. There is not a serious territorial threat from any of this. I would assume people in China know this. There is, however, a political threat if it is perceived by the Han majority that these ungrateful, violent, and barbaric minorities are doing horrible things to our fellow countrymen, and the state is not doing anything about it. And that was the immediate reaction after the riots in 2009 in Urumqi, when a couple hundred Chinese were killed, and it was a demonstration that went violent. And the party saw the political threat coming from Chinese, and that's, I think, what they're responding to with a lot of this excessive and indiscriminate cracking down. Yes.
The CBE program here in the US and the US government are using, unfortunately successfully, some Muslim clergy and some Islamic organizations to push for their own agenda. Is the same thing happening in China, where the Chinese government is using some religious organizations and some imams for their agenda?
So the Chinese government has worked very carefully to centralize all religious training, Islamic training, within a state Islamic association. And you might know more about this than I do, but and keep a very close rein, always have kept a very close rein on imams, and use them, and always have used them to deliver propaganda or the message, in mosques and so on. And then that's why they're very concerned about any kind of religious education that happens outside of the mosque, and they particularly crack down on that in Xinjiang. As far as the CBE goes, though, what we're seeing is something different. They've kind of, at least in Xinjiang, they've really taken religious institutions completely out of the picture, right? Literally, shuttering them, making it so that people are afraid to go to them. I think probably many imams have been locked up in them as well, along with other elites. And they're using a much more, it's more Confucianist. I don't say Confucian, but Confucianistic, perhaps, kind of approach with these ideas about, and communistic. So communist, Confucianistic idea that the individual's identity and thinking, can be remade, right? And can be remade through these highly ritualized and coercive means. Pushing people to go through the motions, recite this propaganda again and again and again, will create a new person. Break down the shell and build them up again. That's the rhetoric that they use.
Now, I was just going to add to that. I had lunch with one of the people who was in this program. There was an expert, a British expert this afternoon, and she was saying how because you have people coming into the house and people coming in and living there for 7 or 9 days, etc., that many Muslims are burning their Qurans, burning anything that would give a sense that they are, are Muslims. So it's not just that you don't cover your head or whatever. You're cleansing simply, because you realize that if you don't, you could be the next one being sent away.
Yes?
Do you think these trends of persecutions and deterrent and intimidation based on religion could affect China's overall constitutional freedoms of religion, at least for the 5 religions that China or the state has deemed as permissible? Do you think that religious freedom in China could be seeing even worse pressure from the state going forward.
Well, yeah, this is so religious freedom. There's various arguments that they sort of say you have the freedom not to believe in religion. They have ways of turning around. But technically, in the Chinese Constitution, there is something that looks like religious freedom, but it has seldom really been observed, and the state can always violate it if it wants to. Now it is doing so in a level quantum level above the violations that have occurred in the past. And there is a broader campaign afoot. Xi Jinping has been eager to crack down on, in particular, Islam and Christianity, with a campaign called Sinification of Religion. So that's applying to Islam among the Chinese Muslims and also to Christianity. A lot of this seems to be targeted at architecture. There's a lot of concern about crosses and crescent moons on the roofs of religious buildings, and they seem to have been taken down a lot. But it's not a good time to be a Chinese Christian either. It hasn't, particularly in some of the underground churches. It hasn't reached the kind of point that it has in Xinjiang either. But yeah, I mean, absolutely, it's a major campaign against religions that are seen to have particularly outside or foreign connections that the state can't control. Yes.
I just have a question specifically about, I guess, the government's link between Uyghurs and extreme, I guess, religious extremism.
Mm-hmm.
Growing up in China, I feel like much of the narrative, like, let's say, entertainment media, social media, or education in general, is kind of putting the Uyghurs as, like, what you were saying, like, this happy image of ethnic minority and removing the Muslim part from it. I was wondering if this is just my skewed education that, I guess what I was getting out of like domestic governmental influence was this completely removing Muslim from the Uyghur identity. Is that different in terms of
So let me ask you. So you obviously consumed that imagery, and and you repeat it very accurately. Did you forget that they were Muslim, or did you also see them as potentially dangerous, or?
To answer the second question, no. I think so. I'm from the Sichuan region,
okay.
Which is where there are a lot of ethnic minorities, which I think helped in terms of my familiarity with ethnic minority and like comfortability with it. But in terms of the Muslim part, I think growing up, I did not know that was part of the Uyghur identity.
You didn't know they were Muslim?
I didn't know they were Muslim.
Okay, interesting, yeah.
Right.
Well, certainly, right, if you look, the imagery is singing, dancing, you see lots of young women, you see
right.
lots of gnarly, but basically, literally toothless old men,
right.
but not dangerous figures, sort of grandfatherly types. You see handsome young men dancing, but other than that, not a lot of healthy, strong young men, right, in the imagery. And people have written about this, and it's actually pretty easy to parse, right? So, and as kind of a strategy of representation, it tends to feminize minorities and make them acceptable, perhaps, right? But at the same time, really kind of diminishing them, right? So that it's yes, minorities. They think what is it? Right? Or right. So they can sing and they can dance, right? And that's particularly common of the Uyghurs. And what's interesting, you still see that even in the propaganda now, about vocational schools and so on and so forth. They always have a dancing scene, right? If you have Uyghur, you always have to have a dancing scene, which Uyghurs they do like to dance, and they dance very well. And Uyghur dance is actually very interesting, right? But as part of the representation, I don't know how conscious it is. I think right now it's just so baked into the stereotypes that they just get perpetuated again and again. But it does have this effect of both trivializing and also kind of... the flip side of it, I think, there is this darker flip side which very easily came in, particularly after 2008. There were rules that Uyghurs were not allowed to rent hotels in China proper, particularly in Beijing. They were so worried about terrorism for that. This has actually been extended to a certain extent to anybody who has Xinjiang on their ID card. So even some Han have had faced discrimination about that. So, you know, there's a dark side and there's this sunny side. I think in a way they go together, right? If you think for representations of minorities, it's very similar that way often.
Could you discuss some of the international response to these internment camps, or even the lack thereof, and where do you expect, I think, international government responses to go from here?
Yeah. So there's been, just to start with the United States, you know, Mike Pence has mentioned them in a statement about religious freedom, as has Secretary of State Pompeo. There has been a much more robust bringing up of the issue by Senator Rubio. He's held hearings, quite public. And some of our U.S. staff in the UN have actually made a point at a couple of hearings to really bring this out. And the first time, this was in the UN Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination back in the summer. And I think it kind of ambushed the Chinese representatives of that. So there's been this, you know, series of statements that have nothing from the White House about it, for reasons that aren't really surprising, I guess, but at various levels from the U.S. European governments a little slower, but we just saw a kind of démarche by 14 Western governments, or the ambassadors of 14 Western governments in Beijing, and they asked to have a meeting with Chen Quanguo, the party head of Xinjiang, as they, you know, go out there. So that was clearly a very public expression of concern. So there's some of this, right? You know, the UN is very difficult right now. China is very powerful in the UN and can really determine what gets brought up, particularly in the Security Council and so on. One big question is, you know, sort of where are Muslim countries or Muslim majority countries in this? And we were just talking earlier, there have been statements from Malaysian Prime Minister and Vice Prime Minister, or the Prime Minister on that, or
Yeah,
future Prime Minister, yeah. Kazakhstan is in a very interesting situation because many Kazakhs have been brought into the camps as well. Some Kazakh citizens who got out ultimately, but there are many marriages across the border and so on, and people have lost loved ones. And there's a group that's collecting information and names in Kazakhstan that has some 1,000 names of Kazakh relatives or Kazakhs or ethnic Kazakhs or Kazakhstanis who are, you know, in the camps like this. So they're advocating for it and pushing. Obviously, you know, Kazakhstan as a government has very close relations with China, or is concerned about China receiving Chinese largesse and so on. So they've been not happy about this, trying to keep the lid on it. But you know, they may not be able to do that too long. Pakistan is somewhat similar. I mentioned before there's issues of traders whose wives have been locked up, who've lost their children. A couple of them demonstrated in Beijing and live streamed it somehow. There have been some marches and things in Pakistan. I believe the Pakistan foreign minister mentioned it in a meeting, but again, for reasons to do with the Belt and Road and Chinese investment and the, you know, all-weather relationship that Pakistan has with China, it hasn't been an official irritant, at least above the waterline yet. Some people say that Middle Eastern countries are mentioning it privately. I don't know about that. They're certainly not making any public comments. And you know, one colleague of mine, Ryan Thum, you know, he says an important thing to remember is, you know, Uyghurs are not Arabs, and so the Arab countries don't necessarily see a particular, you know, reason to make a big to-do about this. Yeah, did you?
And as a follow-up, I noticed when Pompeo met with the Chinese foreign minister, I think 2 weeks ago, he pressed him on the issue slightly, and the foreign minister responded, and they've usually been doing this by saying that it's an internal issue that isn't the concern of other countries, perhaps not even denying the existence of the camps at this point.
Yeah, and that's, of course, that's our standard response in internal issue. This non-interference in internal affairs of other countries is a Chinese, a central tenet of China's foreign policy, with which a lot of other countries agree and approve, right? Particularly other authoritarian countries, they don't have clean hands either, so they don't particularly want to get into this.
And Trump said the same thing, took the same position when he was in Saudi Arabia. That,
Yeah.
you know, we're not, it's not our job to be concerned with what goes on internally, just CVE and business.
Yeah, right. So, you know, that's a popular position in a lot of places.
Well,
So,
thanks very much.
thank you.